You and your colleagues got interested in this topic of economic stress and what it does to the family. Can you tell me why the interest?
Well, this particular project that you all found was a project that I collaborated on with a doctoral student. Given that I'm an infant mental health specialist, we're always very concerned about factors that impact young children. And so because I do a lot of community outreach, I'm always concerned about socioeconomic factors, families' ability to be able to function. And just before that time, we had just started coming out of the recession. And so we were very concerned about what we were seeing. We had lots of families coming in to the clinic that we have that's part of the doctoral program here that were expressing financial distress and concern about being able to afford things that they had afforded before. Parents were going through job changes, people were losing homes, and so it just made sense at that time for my doctoral student and I to start to investigate this particular topic.
Tell me a little bit about that. How did you go about conducting the research?
Well, what we did was we did outreach around the University of Central Florida community. A good part of that sample for that study was actually college students. So, you know, that kind of is an interesting caveat to that. And of course, we have a child care right on campus, so we outreached there and then started to go more broadly out into the community to some of the private preschools. So we got a good sample right around the university to try and understand what was happening in our area, and ended up with about 124 parents. Most of those were moms, a handful, 25 were dads. And so I think, you know, it provided an interesting snapshot of how even university settings can be impacted. I mean, I'm used to going out into the community. I frequent some of the more impoverished areas of Orlando, and their impacts can be much more obvious. But when you're at a university, you feel a little bit more protected, but in fact, everybody was impacted at that time.
Were you talking to mostly younger moms and dads with younger families, or what was the age range?
Kind of young adult to middle adulthood, so we had a range in there. We purposely targeted families, though, who had young children because of my interest in infant mental health. And so we were looking for families who had kiddos that were young, you know, under 5. And so just by that age of the child, you're going to end up with a younger parent sample.
How did you get your information?
It was survey. And so they filled out an economic stress measure for us. We actually used the economic pressure construct that had been part of the Iowa Youth and Family Project. We also asked them about their life stress and their parenting stress. We asked them a little bit about their parenting behaviors. And then we used a gold standard measure that's used throughout clinical psychology when you do child work, the child behavior checklist, to measure the functioning of the little ones that they were reporting on.
And tell me what you found.
Well, it was kind of interesting. I mean, we anticipated that stress factors would be related to increases in behavior problems in young children, and certainly that's exactly what we found. I mean, that makes sense. But it was kind of interesting when you started to really look closely at what was going on in those data. In fact, we found some very different patterns between internalizing behavior problems in kids, which are things like anxieties, depressive symptoms, things of that nature, versus externalizing behavior problems, which are more the acting out behaviors. I mean, it looked like, based on the data that we collected, that the internalizing behavior problems were much more closely related to the economic factors, particularly negative economic events that were happening. And general life stress was more predictive of the externalizing behavior problems in the little ones.
So just to clarify, specifically for the economic stress, when you're talking about those internalizing behaviors, are you talking about a higher rate of anxiety?
The way that that particular measure works, the child behavior checklist, it measures behaviors on a continuum, okay, from less to more. But the nice thing about it is it takes the ratings that you have for any particular child and it puts it in the context of norms for other children the same age as that child. So it gives you a sense of, you know, if the child is over and above experiencing things. And certainly for the most part, we had a non-clinical sample, but we had some range in there, and there were some kiddos who were really struggling. But you know, when you pick apart the pattern of results that we found, things got really interesting because both negative economic events and then also financial cutbacks seem to have a very strong relationship with parenting stress. And that in turn then predicted both internalizing and externalizing behavior problems in little ones. And certainly there were some direct connects with the negative economic events and the financial cutbacks to some of those behavior problems. But the overall trend was that it was kind of an indirect path where the economic factors then created more parenting stress, which then in turn seemed to be related most closely to those behavior problems.
What did you find in terms of changes to parents' behavior and parents' parenting behaviors when they were faced with those job loss or cutbacks? What changed for them in the way they parented their kids?
Well, that was the interesting thing. Like the parenting behaviors that we measured, although they were related, were not the most predictive factors of the outcomes for those kiddos. It was in fact the level of parenting stress overall that was most important.
What did parents report when they had these economic cutbacks?
That in fact their parenting stress was much higher than you would anticipate, and so it was a positive relationship. You know, the more economic impacts that they had, the more parenting stress that occurred, and then in turn the more difficulties their little ones were having.
What kind of problems did you see with the kids?
There was another paper that came out that we referenced when we wrote this particular study up, and it was kind of interesting to think about because parents were thinking kids weren't noticing at all that things were happening, but in fact for the adolescents that were interviewed as part of this other study, they in fact were much more concerned about the economic stressors that their families were facing than parents were even aware of. And to kind of extrapolate back to our sample, you know, people kind of dismiss young children often as not being so aware of things that are going on around them or not being able to talk about things, but that in fact just means that they're going to have much more on the emotional and behavioral end of a display of what their distress might be. So things like increased anxiety, overall kind of agitation or acting out behaviors because they're noticing that their mom or dad are having a difficult time, and so kind of an increase overall in some of those behaviors.
What do those findings suggest?
Well, you know, it certainly suggests that as a society we need to do better overall in helping families. I mean, things that are current right now, things like thinking about minimum wage. You know, our minimum wage is not a living wage, and that means that people who are working minimum wage jobs are having to work more hours to make ends meet, which takes them away from their children. And certainly for our youngest children, having a consistent, stable caregiver who's available to them is critically important. You know, the same kind of argument could be made for parental leave, for example. Many parents go back to work almost immediately, even moms who have just birthed. I've heard of stories and talked with mothers who go back to work 2 to 3 weeks after birthing a baby because they need to make money and they don't have parental leave. I mean, those kinds of decisions as a society are going to impact our littles in ways that are not so positive for their development.
What's the risk down the line, Dr. Renk, for kids who are consistently subjected to this stress?
If parents are not able to make ends meet, that's going to mean a lot more mobility in places that they live or where they stay. We have a reasonably high homeless population around Orlando, where some of our public schools even have programs specifically for homeless youth. You know, things like that impact kids because that doesn't provide them a stable environment. I mean, the kids who do best have a caring, warm caregiver who can provide a stable and consistent environment for them. And even if their parents are doing their best to provide that, those community factors of being unstable certainly can impact their outcomes overall.
You had mentioned you work in a lot of the lower socioeconomic areas around Orlando. Does this issue not cross also socioeconomic lines?
In fact, in our sample, we had a good range. I mean, we had families that were reporting that their income was $10,000 to $20,000 per year. We had families reporting that they were making over $90,000 per year. And so everybody was in that sample. There was no one category that stood out more than the other, so we had a good range of income. But such findings then are going to apply across the board. But certainly as you approach the lower socioeconomic status parts of a city, you're going to have increase in other difficulties. So crime rates are going to go up, ability to feel safe is going to go down, and so other factors are then going to impinge and make the outcomes potentially worse.
Can you give me some tips for parents?
Generally in our society, it is the case that generally moms and dads are working. I mean, it's not as common as it used to be that only dad is going to work. And so thinking about how the schedule is going to work, and if a parent cannot be physically present, making sure that they're emotionally present, and then making the most of the time that they have with their kids when they are present is important. Also thinking about who is going to be available to take care of their child. And I know some people who have difficulty making ends meet kind of have random babysitters and things of that nature. But really the best way to do it is to have a stable secondary caregiver lined up, where if your child is not with you, they are with somebody else who's going to be familiar and consistent and available to them, and kind of be a co-parent in a kind of way. And I know for some parents they may not find that so agreeable because they don't want their child to bond to somebody else. But the truth of the matter is, if you have a secondary caregiver, you really want them to take care of your child as if they are their own. And so for kids to get the kind of care that you would provide them with whatever caregiver that you provide as an alternate is pretty important.
How about tips for identifying the behaviors in your kids?
I think the first thing to note is if there is a change in functioning, and so it may not be that it's a completely obvious problematic behavior, but more so that kids have changed how they're acting. So they don't seem like they're their usual self, you know, they're kind of withdrawn perhaps, not as engaged as they usually are in the family. And certainly parents should be thinking about how they're exposing them to information about stressors in the family anyway. You know, parents often have discussions and think that kids are not paying attention, when in fact our children pick up on all kinds of things that are going on and overhear conversations. And so even having a conversation with them that's developmentally appropriate, especially if you're noticing that change in functioning, to inform them what's happening, not keeping them in the dark.
Give me an example of what you should say, just how to get the conversation going, to bring these things to light.
Well, just things like, you know, I wonder if you overheard me talking to Grandma on the phone, and you might have heard that we might be having some difficulty in our family, or maybe you noticed that I haven't been able to buy you all of your favorite things as of late. I want to let you know that I'm going to take care of that for us. It's not something that you have to worry about. That's Mom's job, that's Dad's job, that's the grown-up's job to make sure that we have what we need, and I'm working really hard at that. But if you have worries about that, I really hope that you would talk to me about that, because I don't want you to have to be concerned.
Is there anything I didn't ask you, Kimberly, that you would want people to know about this line of research?
I'm a big advocate of making sure that children of all ages are safe, but of course I'm most concerned with our youngest citizens, the 0 to 5s. And some people think that they might not be impacted by stressors or trauma, and generally that is not the case. I mean, oftentimes there are big impacts, but people don't really recognize that they're being impacted because they don't vocalize in the same way as older kids might. But anything that's happening anytime between 0 and 18 years of age has the chance to perhaps change somebody's trajectory. So there's a really lovely study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And, you know, with that study, it would suggest that if you've had 4 or more ACEs, as they call them, you're at risk for a whole variety of difficult outcomes, whether it's physical health changes, psychological health changes, other negative things happening in your life, poor parenting, things of that nature, and kind of understanding that, okay, all of our children can be impacted by economic stress, life stress, parenting stress, and that as a society we would do better to kind of support our families in ways where they don't feel like they're having to parent on their own.